And for more on what this means, let's now welcome in CBS Sports fantasy football expert Dave Richard. Dave, you guys did the emergency pod regarding the Dobbins injury earlier, but now it is confirmed. So what now in terms of the Ravens' backfield?
It's time to get on the bus and roll with Gus. Gus Edwards is going to be the lead running back for the Ravens offense. And I went back and did a little bit of a deep dive into just how the Ravens like to utilize their running backs. If you could just indulge me for a second, Jeremy. Long story short, there's been 41 games, regular season, postseason, where Lamar Jackson started. How many times in those games has one running back had 15 or more carries? The answer is 16 times. Not even half the time a running back's gotten that much work. What about 15 touches? 21 out of 41 times, so just barely 50% of the time. This includes all of 2019 when Mark Ingram was their lead guy, and all of 2018 when Gus Edwards was their lead guy with Lamar Jackson. I'm thinking Gus is going to be the lead guy again. I don't know how often he's going to get 15 carries in a game. He's not much of a pass catcher. The Ravens have a couple of interesting running backs behind him as well. They've got this, it's a second-year player named Tyson Williams, who's another big physical back, kind of like Gus Edwards. I kind of like him. I liked his preseason film. And Justice Hill has speed, but he doesn't really have a whole heck of a lot else. It's good for Gus Edwards, and he's a #2 fantasy running back, as long as they don't add another body to their backfield. But if they do, it's obviously going to be bad for Gus Edwards. I'm taking a very passive approach with Edwards in fantasy drafts. I'm not interested in getting him until early round 5 in non-PPR and early round 6 in PPR. I had been wrestling with Damian Harris versus Gus Edwards. And even though Edwards does have a great track record of being efficient and creating yards after contact, I think Harris's schedule is better. And I think once Harris ditches Cam Newton, he's going to be the better fantasy running back from week to week. So I would take him just ahead of Gus Edwards. But we're talking about anywhere between 50th and maybe 65th overall, depending on your league scoring system for Gus Edwards.
So, Dave, you don't see much of a change in the Ravens running game then with Dobbins out?
No, I think they're still going to lean on their running backs, and we've seen that from them for the past 3 seasons. They've ranked at least in the top 13 in the league in running back rushes per game, and it's been at least 22 running back rushes per game each of the past 3 years. The problem is that they like to mix it up. They like to have a second running back in there. Even when Gus Edwards was the #2 guy to Mark Ingram in 2019, he was getting anywhere from 8 to 12 carries per game. I think they're going to try and split that type of work up, at least for now, between Tyson Williams and Justice Hill. That takes Gus Edwards off the field. It also keeps Gus Edwards fresh so he can keep up with that efficient play. But I don't see him evolving into being an every down type of stud for Baltimore. I think he'll end up being a good fantasy running back, not a great one. The one encouraging thing about it is that J.K. Dobbins was taking short yardage goal line work away from Gus Edwards last year in those last 7 games. And now Gus is going to be the main guy there. But they've also got this other running back. Or not a running back. I say running back, Jeremy, but he's a quarterback, and he's really fast, and he makes plays. What is it? It's Lamar Jackson. It's actually a good thing for Lamar Jackson that J.K. Dobbins is out. I think it's going to mean more passes. And last year, he only had 1 carry inside the 5. I think we're going to see him get a few more carries deep in the red zone, come up with a few more rushing touchdowns for Baltimore this season.
So then how does this affect the receiving core for the Ravens with Dobbins out and Jackson potentially being a little bit more active?
Yeah, I think this is actually a great thing for Sammy Watkins, for Rashad Bateman once he's up to 100%. And Marquise Brown, he's the forgotten man in fantasy drafts. But last year, toward the end of the season, the last 8 games, including the playoffs, they lowered his average depth of target. They used him closer to the line of scrimmage. It made for easier throws for Lamar Jackson. I wouldn't be surprised if he saw a bump in targets. Sammy Watkins came close to 95 targets over the course of the season. Maybe a decent option to begin the year while Rashad Bateman still works his way back. And don't forget about Mark Andrews. He could end up being a big benefactor too. Big target in the middle of the field. He's always had a good catch rate from Lamar Jackson, always had a good target share from him as well.
Dave, for guys like me who have yet to draft and like to wait until the end of the preseason before we get the draft in, that week before, this presents obviously opportunities, as you mentioned, Justice Hill and Tyson Williams. But now when I'm going into my draft, if Edwards is a guy that comes off the board a little bit earlier, are Hill and Williams guys that I should be looking at a little bit later in the draft?
You can look at them if you want to, and I would look at Williams ahead of Hill, but that's just my take. It's not based on anything that I've been told or that I've read out of Baltimore. I just think that Williams is the better fit for what the Ravens want to do. And the fact that they've had Justice Hill in their system for a couple of years now, and he hasn't really been able to do much of anything. And Williams isn't going to be on many people's fantasy radar. So I think the approach that you would take is, let's say, Jeremy, it's your second to last pick. You've already taken a defense. You know that you have to take a kicker. You're just looking for someone to throw that dart on. Tyson Williams, there's an apostrophe between the Y and S in his first name. He could be worth your second to last pick. And after 2 weeks, if he's doing bupkis in Baltimore, you cut him and you pick somebody else up off the waiver wire.
Dave, how important is the running back position now with an injury like this? I mean, you and I were talking before we came on. That's 3 starting running backs that are now out for the season. So how much does that make the running back position that much more important when you enter your drafts?
I think it's the beginning and the end of draft strategies. I think unless you're really cool with starting guys like Melvin Gordon and Zach Moss on your fantasy team, you've got to prioritize the position. And we're losing another big name out of it with J.K. Dobbins, replacing him with Gus Edwards. Not the same thing. Just like with Cam Akers being out for the year, replacing him with Darrell Henderson. Not the same thing. ETN's a little bit of a different story because everybody's confident in James Robinson, who looked pretty good today, by the way, against the Cowboys, of being a good fantasy running back. So that one doesn't necessarily count the same way that the Rams and Ravens injuries count. But the position's going to go fast. At least 9 of the first 12 picks in just about every draft this year will be running backs. Probably 16 of the first 24 picks in every draft will be running backs. If you miss out on one of those top guys in the first 2 rounds, you're really hurting your chances of having at least one good running back on your team for the balance of the year.
Want more of the Fantasy Football Today podcast and nonstop year-round fantasy advice? It's simple. Hit the subscribe button and hang with us all throughout the year.